Today we have with us Karan Bhasin, a New York-based economist. The challenge with talking to Karan Bhasin always is that he's well acquainted with so many topics. So it's always difficult to narrow down on any specific issue. So Karan, we'll be talking about a range of issues today. Let's not restrict ourselves to any one issue. How about that?
Yeah, thanks for having me, Tushar. It's a pleasure talking to you after so long. I mean,
Yes,
so
it's
long
been a
on
while.
air. So yeah,
It's been a
let's
while.
clarify. Yeah,
So
yeah.
Karan, the first thing I want to talk to you about, and just been minutes since we crossed the billion doses benchmark in India. What do you make of the vaccination campaign in two respects? One, in context of curbing the spread of the virus, and and from that perspective, one. Two, how are the investors, the economy looking at this entire vaccination drive? Because when this started, there were a lot of apprehensions that India will take 2 3 years, it won't happen before 5 years. So now if you look at from a health point of view, from a health and welfare point of view, that's one. And from a business point of view, what do you make of this billion doses benchmark?
I mean, first of all, I would like to congratulate everyone, and I would like to put it on record that I got both my vaccines in India, and I'm very proud of that fact that I got both of them in India, and I got them quite early on, which is just to say that there was no issue in terms of getting a vaccine, even when a couple of months back, when people were trying to get a slot here and there. So the point really is that India's vaccination drive has been largely very well managed. It has kind of been much better than what we have seen in other countries over the last couple of months. In fact, over the last 1 year, what is emerging to be true is that India's pace of vaccination far supersedes any other country, and that's incredible if you ask me, given that there are a lot of constraints that India faces, whether it's in the form of a per capita income, whether it's in the form of our healthcare capacity, which was largely underinvested over the years. So we've managed to overcome all of that and achieve this, which is truly remarkable. And I think congratulations are in order, not just to the people who made it possible, whether it's the government, whether it's the private sector which stepped up, or the scientists, some of whom are from AstraZeneca in UK, some of them are Indian scientists, whether at Bharat Biotech or at the ICMR. It's just a remarkable feat altogether. And as far as the health question is concerned, I do believe that because of the greater coverage of vaccination, we should be in a comfortable situation going forward. So, but then again, the point with this pandemic is that we have all been proven to be wrong at least once in the past. So there's that caveat that I would like to add over here, that this is something that nobody can predict. But what we can say with certainty is that whatever could be done to prevent a catastrophic situation has been done by the government. So that's what I would like to state on that. And I do believe that, in fact, I'm reasonably optimistic that going forward the situation in India is going to be quite better, and we're going to see significant uptick in economic activity because of these disruptions no longer happening as they are in certain other parts of the world. And I think investors are largely viewing that very positively. Just a couple of weeks back, we saw these stories about coal shortage and power shortages, and you, of course, are there, so you have read, and you would know it better than me, that there hasn't been a power shortage altogether. And it's been 10 days since we've heard that coal stocks were running low, and they were there only for 4 days. And it's been 10 days since that news. Yet there hasn't been a power shortage or a power cut across the country. And I think that speaks the volume to which our economy has become resilient to shocks, and investors are viewing that really positively at the moment. So uh, a couple of days back, I was speaking with a friend of mine, and he's also based out of New York. And essentially, the conclusion was that we are in a phase where money is not going to be a problem. Money is going to keep flowing into India.
Wonderful. And I think one great thing about India touching the billion doses benchmark, of course, we still have 2 billion to look to because it's a two doses thing. And post Diwali, the vaccination drive will pick up as the 84-day gap uh, starts reducing for a lot of people, starts being absent for a lot of people. But yes, we are glad we don't have to be in the lockdown economy anymore. We don't have to be in a state of localized lockdowns. So, Karan, that's the first question. The second question is another big feat of the government and very recent was that of Air India finally going to its rightful owner, the Tatas. And that's, history coming back to square one. The Tatas very happily taking Air India. There was, of course, SpiceJet also in the fray, but of course, it went to Tatas. Now, it wasn't a surprise that the government was trying to privatize Air India for a very long time. That wasn't a surprise. But more than the privatization of Air India, it's also about what it represents, that the government shouldn't be in the business of running a business. What do you make of that?
Well, honestly, as you said, that this shouldn't come as a surprise, but still it did come as a surprise. And the reason is that even though PM has been saying that the government has no business to business, but due to various constraints, privatization, so to say, or as it's recent in the recent past been said, strategic disinvestment wasn't really happening. In fact, this is the first real privatization in its true sense of the word since the Vajpayee government. So that, I think, that's the reason why it came as a surprise. But uh, by virtue of asking what it really represents, is that it represents reversing the clock on nationalization in a way. And I think that's an important point that many are missing, uh, because Air India was largely a private entity. It was nationalized, and I think the coverage on this issue has stressed on that fact a lot. But there is another instance where certain private entities were nationalized and they were banks, and the government has actually also indicated its desire to privatize them, at least two of them, if not more. Now the question really is that will privatization necessarily make things better? And the answer is definitely yes. And we know that because we have privatized hotels in the past and see where they are today and compare them with where they were when they were with the government. Um and for a lot of people who still believe that privatization is not essential, they need to reflect that what is the job of the government at the end of the day. The job of any government is to collect tax revenue and spend it on public welfare. And public welfare really means that education, healthcare, good quality law and order, good policing. Those are critical areas where the state needs to be involved in. Not involved in making all sorts of consumer durables, etc., which nobody really want to buy because they're substandard, sub quality, and too expensive. And that reset is really important. More than that, it's really important for India's population in general to gradually adjust to that reality. And I think that's already happening. Me, you, all of us, young people, we know the importance of privatization, so the younger generation is fully aware of it. And I think that sets in motion a very interesting political economy dynamics where any government will be forced to focus on the essential, and that focus will require it to get rid of what is deemed as non-essential. And that's the essence of PM saying that the government has no business to be in business.
Karan, talking of substandard quality products no one wants to buy, there is this talk of BSNL also being privatized or should be privatized down the lane. Because let's be real, BSNL has not been able to keep up with the changing times. India is now graduating towards 5G. Reliance, Airtel, all of them are working towards it. The new AGR, sort of the moratorium that the government has introduced, will give some breathing space to Vodafone Idea as well. So all of them would be looking to increase their revenue per user through 5G. Reliance would be also getting a lot of users from 2G, 3G to 4G. Where does it leave BSNL, to be honest? I mean, is BSNL in a position to compete? If yes, great. If not, should it be privatized as well?
Well, let me give a sarcastic remark to this. Does BSNL still exist? I think that should answer your question. I mean,
Right.
nobody knows that the entity even exists, right? I mean, what are their employees doing? Because they're virtually non-existent. Then there are no player. So the question really is not of even trying to think about privatizing them, because you're not going to get anything. So what
But
you
they do
should
have
do
a lot
over
of
there is
assets, but they do have a lot
exactly,
of immovable assets.
exactly. So shut the company down and sell the assets, but not the company, not the business, because the business is virtually dead. It does not exist. It does not have a viable revenue model, and it no longer has the appetite to make the necessary investments to compete with the large players in the industry. So even if you were to privatize it, who's going to be willing to buy? I mean, okay, let me ask you this question. Suppose I tell you that I'm going to give you as much money as you want, and you can bid for, you know, a public sector undertaking, anyone, your choice. Will it even be in your consideration?
See,
Absolutely
that's
not.
my only hope for the BSNL as a company is that a lot of users, millions of them, 300-400 million, would be looking to go from 2G, 3G to 4G. That's where the only window of hope for BSNL exists. But are you optimistic of them exercising that skill to make use of that window? That's what I'm thinking.
Look, the point is that those users don't contribute much in terms of the revenue
Hmm.
to the telecom sector. In which case that they are there as consumers, they are better off moving to another provider than staying with them. In fact, them moving on to another provider with cheaper data products, etc., will lead to a lot of efficiency gains for them. So according to me, I see no reason to hold on to this business, which basically means that you sell the movable assets because you will generate a lot more for the government by selling those assets rather than trying to spin it off as a existing business, because I don't think the existing business will generate the necessary interest. You see, if you have a consumer base which is kind of, low value in terms of their monthly revenue generation capacity, then there's no economic rationale for you to go ahead and put necessary investments to move towards 5G, etc. And 5G, by the way, is going to be a capital intensive,
Yes.
sort of, uh, it's a
Infrastructure,
very
right?
capital, yeah, infrastructure wise, and even the auctions are not going to come cheap, given that there's going to be some form of competition now that even Vodafone is trying to raise money and it's looking in a bit healthy position. So in the larger scheme of things, I'm not too sure whether BSNL can even survive, even if it is made a private entity.
Right.
So probably, what can be done is that for the strategic assets, strategic communication, communications, and those assets on which probably railway uses or other government institutions use, that can still be kept with a separate entity, much reduced in size, much reduced in manpower, whereas the rest of it has to be liquidated. So as far as BSNL is concerned, I think my views on that are clear, that if you want to make any money out of it, you better dump all movable, immovable assets as soon as you can. Otherwise, it's going to be another Air India where you're not going to get much out of it. But eventually, at some point, you'll have to give it away.
Right. Talking about privatization, there's also the question of farm laws now. Now, privatization is not alien to India's agriculture sector. Rather, more than 90% of India's agriculture sector is anyway directly or indirectly linked to the private sector. You talk about livestock, dairy, fruits and vegetables, all deregulated from the APMCs. In Punjab, which has been the center for all the protests, we'll keep the politics aside, but there seems to be some resolution in sight. So, as an economist, how do you stress the importance of these farm laws for the future of agriculture in India? Because at some point, we have to start moving out the excessive people involved in agriculture, directly or indirectly, given the share of the contribution in the GDP. So, how important is privatization, even more so now, for the farming community in India, for the agriculture sector in India?
Well, Tushar, you come from Punjab, so you obviously know the region much better than I do. So, so you know all the challenges, and you know the challenge of lowering water table there. So, crop diversification needs to happen for sure. There are no two doubts about it. And I saw your tweet, by the way, about an interview concern, and you gave the
Yes.
precise minutes beyond which the interview becomes interesting, and I saw it. So I think there is an interesting political dynamic there, and my only worry is that will that political dynamic in some way solve the economic situation of the state? I don't know
Hmm,
as yet.
hmm,
I don't know as yet, because I do believe that the farm laws have been essential for
hmm,
the farming community in general, because it will really benefit them in not just the long run but also in the short and medium run.
hmm.
So, and we have discussed this n number of times, and we are both unable to understand the reason behind their protest,
Hmm.
because
But
I think the reason,
the government
yeah.
always stressed on doubling farmers' income, which was the original target set for 2022. Of course, this was before the pandemic, so a lot of targets need to be revisited. But do you see as privatization being one of the critical factors, not just from a procurement point of view, logistics, cold storage, supply chain, all those things, of doubling farmers' income down the lane, keeps the politics aside for a moment.
Absolutely. In fact, that's what I was coming at, that we both have kind of not understood why there is an opposition to this, given that it is such an important intervention, largely to, augment farming income. What really, I mean, I don't think anyone will object to the fact that they are absolutely necessary as far as that is concerned, because if you go by first principles, what is really needed is farm diversification, right? You need crop diversification, you need people to move up the value chain rather than growing wheat, cereal, other cereals and paddy and pulses. You need them to move to higher value fruits, vegetables, and so on and so forth. And that can happen only when markets for those products actually exist. And that's why the reforms were essential in the first place. uh, and but one very good point that you made is that 90% of the market is actually outside the
Hmm.
APMCs. So irrespective of what really happens as far as the APMC law is concerned, within the two or three states that are opposing them as of now, I think across the country there is still scope to implement it. And perhaps what that will do is that will lead to a regional imbalance of sorts, because farmers elsewhere will obviously gain from the laws. So that can kind of create pressure on the three states that are opposing it now to eventually implement it. And by the way, but when I say that states opposing, I don't mean that the state governments are opposing, but I mean more so the people who are protesting from those states, because
Right.
I don't know what the stand of the Punjab government on this is, given that it was a recommendation to the government by a government appointed committee itself. Probably you would have better idea of
Hmm.
what really is the development on that front.
Right. So, Karan, very recently, R. Jagannathan, our editorial director, and I had the privilege of interviewing Nirmala Sitharamanji, the finance minister, and she spoke at length about reforms and how reforms are going to be critical into for India's V-shaped recovery, and how reforms are even critical for an economy that is moving towards the 5 trillion goal, say 2, 3, 5 years from now. What do you make of the recent reforms that have been announced by the government?
Well, there have been so many of them. So it's kind of going to be a bit of a challenge for all of us who kind of like studying about reforms to
But overall,
disentangle, yeah, to disentangle the impact of any individual reform on the growth prospect. But what we do know is that they will augment India's growth rate. And the reason that happens is because, and I've kind of repeated this several times, that growth really happens because of two reasons. You can grow more if you put more labor and more capital into the economy. So obviously, if you have more inputs, you have more output, and growth happens. Or if your productivity goes up, so you can produce more using the same level of inputs and outputs. In this particular case, what reforms really do is that they improve your productivity levels. Let's take the example of labor, right? Labor reforms ease out restrictions, ease out frictions, allow people to move freely from different places, from the primary sector to the manufacturing sector, by incentivizing people to set up manufacturing facilities. And what that does is that for the unit, for the person who moves away from agriculture, as you alluded to during the start of the discussion, he's moving from a low productive place to a high productive job. So even though he was employed earlier, but that he needn't really be employed there, because he's better utilized elsewhere, and now he can be better utilized elsewhere. So those kind of first level, second level, third level kind of results are going to show up, and it becomes critical post pandemic, largely because during the start of the pandemic, it was still unclear whether it will have a permanent impact on the growth process, because, and I think even now we don't know whether there will be any permanent scarring as far as the growth implications are concerned. And this is true not just for India, this is true globally.
hmm,
But what we can say with certainty now is that because of those reforms that have happened, many of them were deemed impossible to have happened in this decade, let alone in the tenure of this government. We can be sure that there will be no scaring as far as the growth prospects are concerned. There are still concerns about nutritional outcomes due to midday meal not being served, etc. But I'm sure eventually, once schools do open, there will be ways to figure out how to best bridge that gap. So I'm very optimistic that we will emerge as one of the few countries to have left unscarred as far as the permanent impact of the pandemic is concerned. Our neighbor, in fact, many of our neighbors are not so lucky. They haven't been so fortunate. In fact, they will be scarred much beyond what is being perceived at the moment. So that's going to
I,
be another dynamic in the region.
I would come to that, but before that, your thoughts on the V-shaped recovery, because a lot of critics, a lot of stakeholders are already questioning. Of course, there is a V-shaped recovery. The growth is there. We saw contraction last year, which was due to the shutdown of the economy. We've seen a reversal this year, but to go to the pre-pandemic levels and to establish a growth rate of 6 or 7% or more from there, do you think that's possible?
Well, the IMF seems to be optimistic on it. Their forecast for next year also puts us at the fastest growing major economy of the world, and that's kind of interesting for various reasons because what it essentially is alluding to is the fact that our one of our neighbors is going to grow at 5%, and we know which is the neighbor that I'm
Hmm.
referring to, and we are going to grow at 8%. But incidentally, there was a new forecast by the Institute of International Finance that says that they're not going to grow at 3%, which means that essentially we're going to grow at double their rate over the next couple of years. And I think because of the discussion that we've just had, especially on the potential growth on factor productivity, etc., probably our potential growth rate is going to be around 7.5%. Of course, these calculations have to be done regularly, they have to be updated, etc., and I will obviously do that as we go along, but my understanding is that 7.5% is the potential rate of growth going forward, which means that on an average we should register that as the annual average growth rate over this decade. I wouldn't be surprised if it's actually 8%. That wouldn't come as a surprise to me at the moment. Uh, Look, money is not going to be a problem, as I said. Money is going to keep coming in, which means that there will be new investment opportunities that were probably not explored before because of lack of money or for whatever reason. They will open up. There is already a lot of high value employment creation in the space sector ever since it was opened up. Drones again, and another area where we are creating a lot of jobs. Incidentally, I saw this one tweet a couple of months back by Vijay Shekhar Sharma and the CEO of Ola, which where they actually mentioned that it's cheaper to get an engineer in San Francisco than in Bangalore. I don't know whether they were kidding or whether that's actually true, but they were talking about the mid senior level of management. And my understanding is that that's actually true in India. Wages are actually going up, and that's a positive sign because that shows that there is internal dynamism in the economy. People's purchasing power is going up. There's innovation that's happening, and you of course write a lot about startups, so and the tech scene, and you're an avid follower, so you know how many unicorns we've had this year. So 7%, 7.5%, it's a done deal.
You talk of unicorns, and India this year has more unicorns than China. India has registered more unicorns than China. And there is an indication that India's digital economy has finally taken off. And even then, it's just the tip of the iceberg. Even then, there are just 500-600 million Indians on the internet. And we're still like looking at 1 billion internet users in India alone by 2024. So there is still a lot of potential in India's digital economy. If I talk about retail, e-commerce, transportation, logistics, and so forth. What do you make of all these unicorns? Of course, some of them have business models which will raise a lot of eyebrows. The speed at which they're burning cash, the kind of repo they enjoy with their investors, with their stakeholders within the business, like Zomato, with the restaurants, all those questions will keep happening, and that's an evolving situation. But you look at the unicorns in India, and suddenly we find ourselves where China was perhaps 10 years ago, and we're like, okay, this is our point. This is where our digital economy starts to take off. So, what do you make of that?
Well, I think the advantage that we have over others is that we kind of have a capacity. In fact, we have the luxury rather to learn from their mistakes. And by their mistakes, I mean the mistakes that were made before the dot com boom, and at the same time the mistakes that were made in China recently. The point being that when there is capital involved, capital will always kind of figure out a way to allocate, even in fact make risky investments, and some of those will work out, some of them will not. But eventually, even if you look at the dot com boom, and the subsequent bust. I think we are slightly better off today because of Amazons and Googles, and they were made possible only because there was a lot of capital baked into the system which was willing to take the risk. So I'm yes, I'm concerned about some of these unicorns not really having viable business models over the long run. But at the same time, I'm also optimistic that for at least 10 of them that don't work out, at least one of them will. And the one that will work out will eventually create a lot more value over the longer run for Indians, for their employees, shareholders, investors than before. And the reason why I'm optimistic is also because a lot of these big tech guys are thinking about listing in India.
Hmm.
I mean, who would have ever thought? Singapore's the place where you list, right? If you're in the tech scene, not India. But then why are they listing in India now? I
Hmm.
think that's the story. That we have changed something fundamentally over the last couple of years.
And it's a good time to start investing for the people in their 20s, given India's stock market. It's like great potential, and I keep seeing these tweets from economists like you, Rajiv Mantri, that people should start investing. Harsh also writes about this often, that Indians need to start investing. That culture needs to come where people understand that investing in stock market is not a taboo. It's not only something that only a few individuals could do. So that's great. But Karan, coming to my final question, something interesting and sort of scary is playing out in China right now. It's just a couple of days to the weekend in Evergrande, the biggest real estate group, would have completed a month since it missed its bond payments. And if they miss it on this weekend as well, which they are sort of looking to do, it would be they would be categorized as a defaulter. So, what is playing out in China right now? It's not a Lehman moment, of course, because of the nature of the economy is very different. The restructuring would be different than what was happening in US under the trap program. But it's very similar to 2008 cheap housing plans, a surplus of houses. And in this case, it's the real estate developers that are missing out on their bond payments. And just not one, Fantasia is another group which has missed out, and a couple of others have also. So, what do you make of the situation in China? Because this is sort of threatening their growth, which was at 4.9% for the last quarter.
So this will require a detailed answer actually, because there are a lot of factors that are involved into it.
Hmm.
First thing is that when I went back and looked at Chinese data, I found something quite interesting, and one of my friends who actually is from that particular country.
Hmm.
I'll not name him for his security because you never really
Hmm.
know, so to say. But yeah, he pointed out about this anomaly, and then I went back and I looked at it and I found it to be true that China's growth actually started slowing in mid 90s, and they were not willing to adjust to it. And
Hmm.
because they weren't willing to adjust to it, what subsequently happened was that they were looking for ways to kind of create growth out of nowhere.
Hmm.
Luckily, WTO inclusion actually happened, and they kind of got another lease line. And after that, again, then when 2008 happened, they were pretty much screwed. I
Hmm.
mean, they didn't know what to do. They didn't know how will they grow, etc. And at that point, the government, which over there is the party, Chinese Communist Party, decided that they're going to give targets and incentives, and they gave growth targets and growth incentives. And when you're going to be rewarded for creating more growth, you just want to create more growth, irrespective of whether it comes, by way of
Hmm.
building up of more debt. And that's exactly what happened. So provinces went up on a debt sprint. So you're talking about the housing crisis. There's a much bigger debt crisis that's going on there, and that pertains not just to the housing levels of debt, but also to the exorbitantly high levels of provincial debt, which is equivalent to their states, etc., who have borrowed heavily to build these massive cities.
Hmm.
In some cases, even finance the construction activities of
Hmm.
these builders where nobody lives. And we saw those videos coming out a couple of months earlier
Of
of
houses being
people
demolished.
demolished, exactly, because
Yes.
there's no demand. And
I
there's no
remember,
demand
Karan.
because
I remember, Karan, when the U.S. Treasury was faced with the challenge of excessive houses, supply of houses. The one idea that was floating was that the U.S. Fed should buy out all the houses and burn them down just to stabilize the prices. And 12 years
yeah.
later, China is actually doing that. They're
I
just
mean, they actually
demolishing.
tried it, and still it didn't work because there's value there. You've invested and built up debt, right? And
Yes.
that debt doesn't go away.
Right.
Fortunately for them, because it's like largely a closed loop system, right? They
Hmm.
can decide about how they want to restructure, etc., which is what you
Hmm.
said. As far as the private debt is concerned, same
Hmm.
even with the public sector debt of the provincial governments, etc. The problem really there is that what happens to those who are holding who are holding the bonds, who are foreign investors, right?
Hmm.
You've had the big tech crackdown where foreign investors lost money. Then you had the scam where a lot of Chinese companies listed in the US duped investors which didn't have
Hmm.
business models. And now this. So,
Hmm.
of course, foreign investors are, as it is, very wary about what's actually going on there. On top of it, you have a power crisis where production facilities are shut. Then you have a problem that you don't have people who want to work because you
Hmm.
have a shrinking labor supply because of your one child policy, and now you want to reverse it by incentivizing people to have more kids, but people don't want to have more kids because housing is much more expensive than what it used to be before.
Hmm.
So cumulatively what I feel is that what has really transpired is that the chickens have come home,
Right.
and that's exactly why people are saying that they're going to find it difficult to grow at 3% going forward.
Hmm.
uh, and I think that's not necessarily good.
Hmm.
And the reason I say that is because eventually, in a globalized economy, you do want everyone to do s- good enough so that the global economy keeps on expanding. In
Hmm.
this particular case, because of their own missteps, uh, they will have to kind of suffer, uh, and people will eventually end up suffering rather than the CCP, which is gonna just
Hmm.
wash their hands of it. And we in India have had the experience of dealing with a bad debt problem for many
Hmm.
years. Now they're going to realize that it's far more complicated than what many people understand, and unfortunately their decisions in response to that
Hmm.
uh, haven't been that inspiring in terms of confidence for investors who are looking out on the outside.
Right.
So net, of course, there's a great opportunity. There's a great India story that's just beginning to emerge, so to say,
Hmm.
and it just coincides with kind of the China story coming to an end.
Of course, there's a lot more to talk about. Also, look at the semiconductor shortage that is impacting so many industries across the world. At the heart of it is again China. Just the other day, I was reading about the magnesium shortage, which is a consequence of the coal crisis in China. And that would
Yeah,
again impact the automobile industry because they use it for the aluminum alloys. So, a lot is happening across the world. But what we can look at is of all this, I think you pointed out correctly, India would not be the one to be permanently scarred by the pandemic. And I think that's a great way to sum up the entire situation because there's so much happening across the world. The US has a political crisis of its own, the Chinese have an economic one, Europe has been confused since the Second World War, so as to look at it. And then the UK has its Brexit problems going on. They had a crisis very recently. But that was a very engaging, insightful conversation, Karan. Thank you for your time. And I think we'll be doing more of these coming in the coming times. Thank you so much.
always my pleasure, Tushar.